welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something I know you're really curious about, the origins of language.
It's a real puzzler, isn't it? I mean, just imagine, like, everything we do with language, like writing a poem or having this conversation, all came from, much simpler ways of communicating.
It's mind-blowing when you think about it like that. And we've got a great lineup of sources for you today. Everything from those classic theories to some really cutting-edge research. We're talking textbooks, journal articles, the works. Our mission today is to give you a clearer picture of how language might have first emerged. And let me tell you, there are some real surprises along the way.
Absolutely. What I find really fascinating is just how many different fields are involved in trying to figure this out. Anthropology, genetics, neuroscience. It's a real team effort.
Okay, so let's get right into it, okay? We're talking about a process that happened over millions of years. How on earth do we even start to trace something as, well, invisible as language, that far back?
That's the real challenge, right? It's not like we've got fossils of ancient conversations just lying around. I mean, imagine trying to work out the history of music, but all the instruments and recordings have vanished. All you have are a few vague descriptions.
So talk about a head-scratcher.
Yeah.
So, where do we even begin with this puzzle?
We have to look for clues in what did survive. Things like the anatomy of our vocal tract, how our brains have evolved, even how our primate relatives communicate. By putting those puzzle pieces together, we can start to form some hypotheses about how language came to be.
It's like being a detective, but across time. And I guess one of the biggest questions is, when and where did language actually first appear? Was it a sudden thing, like an aha moment in human evolution? Or was it a gradual thing over many, many generations?
And just as important, was it something unique to humans? Or could it be that the capacity for language goes way back in our primate family tree, just kind of waiting for the right moment to emerge?
Which brings us to that classic debate, nature versus nurture. Is language something we're born with, an instinct, or is it something we pick up from our surroundings?
Oh, it's a fascinating debate, and it's not a simple case of one side being right and the other wrong. Think of it like a tug of war both sides are pulling, and that tension is what moves us forward.
Okay, I like that, the tug-of-war analogy. So who are the main players on Team Nature?
Well, one of the biggest names is Noam Chomsky, a linguist who really shook things up. He argued that humans have this built-in capacity for language, something he called universal grammar. Now, he wasn't saying that we're born knowing, like English or Spanish. He meant that our brains are wired with the basic rules of grammar that let us learn any language.
So it's like we come with the operating system pre-installed, and then we download different languages as we go.
That's a great way to put it. And this idea would explain how kids can learn languages so incredibly quickly, often mastering complicated grammar without anyone directly teaching them those rules.
Right, that makes sense. But what about Team Nurture? What's their side of the story?
Well, Team Nurture really emphasizes the role of culture, learning, and social interaction in shaping language. They point to the sheer diversity of languages out there, thousands of them, each one shaped by the history, environment, and needs of the people who use it.
So it's less about a pre-programmed language instinct and more about the amazing adaptability of the human brain to learn and change.
Exactly. And as we go deeper, you'll see how both sides of this debate have added important pieces to the puzzle of language evolution. It's not about picking a winner, but rather understanding how these forces, nature and nurture, might have worked together.
So we've got these two powerful forces in play, what we're born with and what we learn from our environment. But to really wrap our heads around how they might have shaped language at the very beginning, I think it helps to look back at how our understanding of this has changed over time.
Totally. Tracing the history of ideas about language evolution, well, it's a bit like piecing together a historical mystery in itself.
And like a lot of big scientific stories, this one starts with a familiar name, Charles Darwin.
Right, of course. Darwin, the guy revolutionized biology, but he also had some thoughts about language. He actually thought that maybe language started with something like musical proto-language, similar to bird songs.
So he imagined our ancestors serenading each other with melodies, and those eventually became more like, well, actual language.
Yeah, precisely. Although, of course, as more research was done, it seemed like maybe that jump from bird song to human language was, a bit more complex than that.
Fair enough. It was an interesting place to start. So what came after that?
Well, in the mid-20th century, there was this big movement called behaviorism. And B.F. Skinner, a really famous psychologist, said that language was mainly learned through rewards and punishments. Like, if a baby says something right, they get praised, and if they get it wrong, they get corrected.
Ah, so they saw language as just another learned behavior then, kind of like I don't know, learning to ride a bike or something.
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, that theory couldn't really explain how creative and complex language really is, right? I mean, we don't just repeat things, we come up with new sentences, new ideas, new words all the time.
Exactly. It's like saying you could write a symphony just by listening to enough music. You need some kind of creative spark to
Hmm.
actually go beyond just imitation. And that's where Chomsky comes back in, right? With his universal grammar.
Yeah, you got it. Chomsky said that there's no way that kids could pick up language so easily and so fast just from learning alone. So he proposed this idea that humans have this inborn knack for language, a kind of blueprint in their minds that helps them learn it.
So this was a big deal, right?
Yeah,
If Chomsky was right, then language wasn't something we just learned. It was something we were born with, something that made us different from all other animals.
absolutely. But it doesn't stop there. Then a new group of researchers came along, the adaptationists, and they said, hold on, maybe language evolved slowly over time through natural selection, just like any other useful trait.
Okay, so in this view, language is like a tool that we developed because it helped our ancestors survive, right?
Exactly. Imagine being able to share important info with each other for hunting or sharing knowledge or keeping the group organized. It makes sense that the ones who were better at communicating would have a better chance of surviving, right? So over time, those communication systems would become more and more sophisticated.
Makes sense. But it feels like both nature and nurture have to be involved, right? You need the ability for language in the first place, but you also need the environment, the social interactions, to shape how it actually develops.
Absolutely. Which leads us to cultural evolution, this idea that learning and social interaction and cultural innovation all play a huge role in how language is shaped.
So it's not just our genes, it's how those genes interact with this constantly changing cultural world.
That's it. I mean, languages change all the time. They adapt to new places and new tech and new ways of thinking. And, every generation passes their language down to the next with little changes here and there, and they build up over time.
So we've gone from Darwin's musical proto-language to behaviorism, Chomsky's universal grammar, adaptationism, and now cultural evolution. It's like
Yeah.
each of these ideas has added a new layer to how we understand this incredibly complex thing we call language.
And it's that complexity that makes studying language so captivating. There's no one simple answer, right? It's about taking evidence from all these different areas, linguistics, anthropology, genetics, even neuroscience, and trying to understand how language became this essential part of being human.
Okay, so we've met the major players. We've talked about the big theories in language evolution. Now, I kind of want to get down to the nuts and bolts of it all. We all know language is complicated, but what are the basic building blocks that were needed for us to go from simple calls to, writing novels and everything in between? So we've been thinking about the big picture of language evolution, the different theories, the debates, where it all fits into history. But I kind of want to zoom in now, get into the actual nuts and bolts of language itself. Like, what are the core pieces that had to come together for us to develop this amazing system of communication that we have?
It's almost like we're looking under the hood of a car, right? I mean, we can appreciate how it gets us from A to B, but to really get it, you got to look at the engine, the transmission, all those parts working together.
Okay, I like that. So what would be the language equivalent of those car parts? What makes our communication engine run?
Well, linguists break language down into different levels. First, you have phonetics. That's all about the actual sounds of speech, how we make them with our vocal cords and our tongue and teeth and lips, all that.
It really is incredible how we can create so many sounds with just those few things, isn't it?
It really is. Then you've got phonology, and that's about how those sounds are organized, how they combine to actually mean something in a specific language, like which sounds are meaningful and how they go together to make words.
So phonology is like the traffic system, making sure all the sounds are flowing smoothly and making sense.
Exactly. And then you've got morphology, which is how words themselves are put together, like prefixes and suffixes, and how you can combine little bits of meaning into bigger, more complex words.
Right, like adding un to happy to get unhappy.
Right.
Just that tiny bit changes the whole meaning.
Exactly. And then we move up to syntax, which is how those words are arranged into sentences and phrases. This is where grammar comes in, the rules about word order and how they all connect to each other.
So syntax is like the grammar police, making sure everything's in the right place.
Huh, I guess you could say that. It's more about making the meaning clear than being correct, though. And finally, you have semantics, which is all about meaning itself. How those words and sentences actually relate to the world around us, how we use language to talk about thoughts and feelings and ideas.
So semantics is like the heart of language, where all those sounds and structures actually start to mean something.
Exactly. And what's amazing is that all of these levels, from the physical sounds to those abstract meanings, they have to work together perfectly for language to work at all. It really shows how amazing the human brain is.
It really does. And speaking of the human brain, how did the way our bodies evolved, our brains, and vocal tracts especially, how did that play into the development of language?
Oh, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. We know our ancestors went through big anatomical changes over millions of years, and some of them were directly related to language. One of the biggest ones was the larynx, our voice box, moving lower in the throat. Humans have that lower than other primates.
So is that why we can choke on food, but also why we can make so many sounds?
You got it. That lower larynx gives us a wider range of vocalizations. It's like the physical setup we needed for all those complex speech sounds.
Wow, that's wild. What about our brains? Those must have been important too.
Absolutely. When we look at fossils, we can see that brain size increased massively during human evolution, especially the frontal lobe, which is where we handle language. So as our brains got bigger, more complex, so did our capacity for language.
Like you were getting an upgrade just for talking to each other.
Kind of. It's more likely that all these changes were connected. Bigger brains, maybe that led to more complex social structures, which then meant we needed better ways to communicate. And needing to communicate, that could have driven both language and brain development even further, so it's like a feedback loop.
It's amazing how it all ties together. It's not just our brains and vocal tracts either, right? Our senses had to be involved too.
Totally. Take vision, for example. It's not just about reading and writing. Some researchers believe that even our ability to gesture, to use our hands and bodies to communicate, that might have been a step towards spoken language.
So we were talking with our hands before we were talking with our mouths.
That's the idea. And there's actually some evidence for it. If you look at sign languages, they're full-fledged languages, just using gestures instead of sounds. It shows that you can have complex communication systems even without spoken language.
That is so cool. It really shows how language is bigger than just words. It's our bodies, brains, the world around us, all interacting.
Exactly. And this leads to a really important idea: gene-culture co-evolution. Basically, our genes and our culture, they've evolved side by side, each one shaping the other over time.
So it's not nature versus nurture. It's both of them working together to make us who we are.
That's it. Our genes, they give us the potential for language that's in our DNA. But the specific languages we speak, how we use them, that's all shaped by our culture and our environment, who we interact with.
So it's like our genes provide the ingredients and culture is the recipe.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And that back and forth between genes and culture has been influencing language for as long as humans have been around.
Wow, this has been quite a deep dive. It's amazing to think about something we use every day, our ability to communicate, and where it all came from.
Truly one of the wonders of evolution, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. But before we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about. If language has always been changing, what do you think the languages of the future will be like? Could we be communicating in ways we can't even imagine right now? That's something to think about. And thank YU for joining us on this incredible journey into the origins of language. Until next time, keep those linguistic curiosities burning.